A letter arrived calling him Derrit and saying they had not seen each other for a long time, that 10 years had passed, and that Military wanted him to come to the capital. He folded the letter, looked away, and forced a smile as nostalgia washed over him. A few days before this event, the scene took place in the city of Rashin at the Guild of Blacksmiths. A voice asked what they had told him. He was the main character, asked if he had really been fired and wanted to know why, and was clearly upset by those words, while opposite him stood a man with a girl on his arm. The man began shouting that there was no point in him working in the guild. Derrit did not defend himself and was stunned by the words. The protagonist apologized to him and asked him to explain more clearly, but the guild leader said he simply offered very poor value. It turned out to be Guildmaster Sinan. Sinan said that was why he was firing him and that he had many things to do, so he should leave quickly. Derrit did not argue and said he was leaving. Sinan was glad it had all gone smoothly, stuck out his tongue, and happily said that good riddance to him. The protagonist decided to go to the capital. He climbed into the carriage and it drove off. The coachman announced they had arrived. At that moment, Tourette told the boy he had fixed his thing. The child held the toy happily and began talking about the horse moving, while the woman beside him watched with a smile. After the protagonist left the cart, the boy thanked him and called him Grandpa, and Derrit reflected on how much time he had spent as a blacksmith. After 30 years of doing this, he was quite an old man. Still, he reached out toward the sky and watched it closely. Derrit found himself in the kingdom of Gloss, more precisely in its capital, a modest city ringed by mountains and forests. Walking the city streets, the protagonist looked around and noticed there were more people than on his previous visit. On reflection, he hadn't really left anything in writing. Leaving felt like a good opportunity and he began humming a tune. A stall suddenly caught his eye. He went over and asked the saleswoman what she recommended. She suggested the wild boar shashlik, so he bought one. After paying, he picked up the meat on the skewer and began to eat. It was clearly still hot, but Dure enjoyed it immensely and said it was delicious. The woman said she had never seen him before, then asked where he came from, and the protagonist explained he came from Written. The man said he had worked in the Blacksmiths Guild but was fired, and people shouted, asking if the person he was talking to understood how much the falchion was worth. Furious, the girl held the broken sword and said it could not even cut the twig at the tip. The young man angrily replied that she simply did not know how to use it, and it was clear he was irritated. The protagonist immediately asked what was happening and whether it was really an argument. The woman said it was coming from the gun shop. The saleswoman said their weapons don't have a very good reputation. He just chuckled at her words and thought people like that are everywhere. Dure said he would go take a quick look, thanked her for the delicious food, and the woman warned him to be careful. The customer kept yelling that the man had said the sword was made of steel and would handle the plant monster, and then the man asked whether he had really sold her a fake. The arms dealer said she had no evidence, while he wore an evil grin and looked slightly furious. Angry that he was right and feeling it was unfair, the girl saw the child turn to her, call her mom, and suggest they stop arguing and leave. By then, the protagonist had moved closer to the scene and looked at the sword's stump, wondering whether the man truly claimed to be made of steel. Derrit then turned to the arms dealer and told him that lying was wrong, drawing the attention of the disputants and the crowd. As a blacksmith, he explained the sword was fake, clearly made of tin, not steel. The arms dealer instantly pointed at him and insisted nothing like that could happen, calling it slander. The main character asked the woman if he could hold the object for a moment, and she agreed. He then said it was the proof. Derrit said everything on the blade is visible and the ripples are clear. If there was steel inside, the trace would be straight. People in the crowd were already saying a blacksmith they knew had told them the same thing. It was clear the main character was telling the truth. Someone went to fetch a guard. The arms dealer grew very angry and passed out dirty, and Derrit said this man was deceiving people and exploiting their ignorance. The main character was stern and angry about the situation and turned to the man, telling him to be a responsible blacksmith. The arms dealer shook with rage. Ordering the man to be quiet, he blamed him for everything, grabbed a sword, and warned him not to try anything. A man ran straight at the main character and told him to stop preaching. The main character told the people around him to step aside and cursed under his breath. As the arms dealer approached Tourette, a girl stepped in front of him and told him to stop. Then the stranger knocked the sword from his hands, and the main character and the dissatisfied customers were shocked by her actions. The arms dealer lay unconscious on the ground. The girl told the guards to take him away, and they complied. Then the whole crowd grew very happy, smiles spread across their faces, and some people raised their hands in a joyful gesture. The crowd realized she was the soldier's commander and thanked her loudly as the main character stood in shock. He looked at her and thanked her, saying she had saved him. She said it was her job. Suddenly she noticed something. Studying him closely, she grew a little nervous and stammered as she tried to ask him a question, while Dore began to feel uneasy under her attention. He wondered whether he looked unemployed or like a suspicious old man about to be arrested when he heard the end of the question asking if he was a teacher. A bright smile lit her face, and a soft blush rose to her cheeks as she said her name was Militar, and asked whether he remembered her. The commander said that 10 years ago the main character made her a toy sword, and the main character immediately remembered the little girl with a ponytail. Dorette then looked at her more intently, smiled, and said she had grown so much, and he had not expected to meet her here, and she replied happily that it really was him. The girl asked him whether he had received her letter. At that moment, her subordinates asked who this man was. Militar replied that the protagonist had looked after her when she was very little, so she would chat with him for a bit. After that, the girl told her subordinates to go back first. They agreed. Darrett, shocked, asked whether she had really become a commander, and she said it was thanks to him. The protagonist started to say it was an amazing achievement, and the girl replied that it was not, that it was all thanks to her sword. Darrett asked what she meant by that. Militar then asked him to look at him. She slowly began to get him. The man's face was very tense. The main character picked up the sword and saw it was pitch black. Discovered it was the divine magic sword, Shinma, rank S, element holy, and when he called it the country's treasure, the military replied that he had made it. Direct wondered how he could forget such a sword, blamed it on age and dementia, and the girl told him to let her rephrase her sentence. Military said seriously that the toy sword he made for her had evolved. Shocked, the main character asked her about it again, saying he had never heard of such a thing, and the girl replied she had never seen it before either. Militar said it changed shape as she grew and eventually became like this. As a child, it looked like a small dagger, but when she was older and more aware, it turned into what it is now. After that, the girl told the main character that the weapon he had made could likely evolve. He stared at the sword in shock. Dorrit studied it closely, unsure if the sword was really a toy from that time, and tried to match his memories to what he saw. The main character asked again whether it had really been a toy, and said he couldn't believe it. Militar called it the maturation of feelings. Dorrit looked at her. Militar explained that this was her hypothesis. The girl looked at him and asked whether anyone had noticed anything similar in writing when he created tools. The protagonist replied no, saying there were no more adventurers there. People often change things in writing. As a blacksmith, he felt he could not open a shop there. He said aloud that his creations were being discarded faster than they could be opened. The girl interrupted to confirm it and said she had called him for a specific purpose. Military met his gaze with resolve, her eyes bright and cheeks flushed, and asked him for a favor. The main character said she had written about it in a letter, and when he asked what she needed, she took his hand and said it was simple. She asked him to become the personal blacksmith for their valiant army, tailoring the role to suit him as much as possible. The main character immediately flew away from her and refused, saying it was too much for him, and the girl bowed and admitted she had asked too much. The military approached him again. She said they had no one else to ask. Dorette was stunned. He stammered and asked why they had chosen him. The girl replied that there were circumstances, and he immediately asked again what they were, when the woman he had helped earlier intervened in the conversation. Smiling, she thanked him for his help and said she didn't even know how to thank him. The girl beside her turned to Militare, called her commander, and thanked her. Militare did not look pleased. A girl approached her and said she had seen her at the entrance ceremony and was relieved that no one was hurt. A soldier grabbed the protagonist's hand and said they had to hurry. Shocked, he was silent at first, then abruptly asked where they were going. At that moment, the woman and the girl kept shouting that they wanted to thank him, so they suggested he check into a hotel in the Eastern District. The protagonist thought he was making useful connections. He waved, smiled, and said he would stop by. But Melita interrupted him, saying he hadn't said anything, Otherwise, she would bite her tongue. As recorded in the Blacksmith Guild, Sinan was styling his hair and then carefully checked his appearance. Closing his eyes, he struck a pose and thought he looked dazzling, then smiled and winked. Then he went to the workers, greeted them, asked whether they were ready to earn money, and his subordinates greeted him back. Smiling, the man said they would now begin the morning meeting. First, they would start with their guild's philosophy. A stranger interrupted at that moment and asked for forgiveness. Sinan turned to him and asked who he was. A dark-haired man stood there with several guards behind him. The man moved up to the guildmaster and asked if the main character was there, looking very serious. No one answered him, so he asked again whether Dorette was here and said he was a messenger from the royal palace named Senji. A man said he was looking for the famous blacksmith and that Dorette had a request for him, and Sinan grew very angry and asked if the man really had such a request. The man said he was the guildmaster here and asked if he had any requests for Mr. Sinan, but when he got a negative reply, he became even angrier. Sinan said the main character was no longer here and that he had fired the useless person, and Senji was shocked and asked him again whether he had really fired him. The man said Tourette was only draining the guild's resources and that he did not respect Tourette at all. Sinan said smugly that he got what he deserved. Senji stepped back and asked if Mr. Darrett really was not there. His condition worsened, and he kept talking about the queen's prized blacksmith being fired. Senji said everything had gone wrong, and the soldiers asked what they should do with it. Sinan suggested they give it to him, but the man said they had been told to give it to the main character. Furious, the man approached the soldier, grabbed the box, and demanded to know what was inside. The soldier immediately asked what he was doing, and Sinan said he was the guildmaster here. The latter said angrily that he had far more experience than the main character. Then he opened the box and was surprised. Initially, the angel Amatsurugi's sword was an S-rank blade with the saint element and seemed to glow. Sinan even began to tremble, saying it was so beautiful and looked exactly like the sword of a real angel. Senji said they had to give it to Mr. Darrett for repairs, and the man wondered why he had to be the one to hand over the treasure. Sighing, he said he made it and stressed again that Mr. Darrett himself was its creator. Sinan thought again about the claim that the protagonist had made this sword. His face showed both anger and shock. He grabbed Senji by the collar and yelled that this was clearly not a funny joke. Sine-on said the man could not have created it. The guard then said he should let Mr. Senji go. Mr. Senji said the sword was not really in that form. When Senji said the Amatsurugi was a sword that had evolved, the room immediately fell silent. Sinan was shocked, asked whether the sword had really evolved, then said they really thought he was a stupid person. Senji looked at him and said it was true. The queen immediately ordered that he be found. His tone left no hint of a joke. Sinan shouted again that he could not stand it, then walked to the sword and said he would fix it now. Senji put his hand up and told him to stop because he wasn't being direct. The man said he was the guildmaster and therefore the best blacksmith here. He then looked at the others, said smugly that he was the boss, and asked them to wait here. Senji thought that made sense. He kicked everyone out of the room, went back to the sword, checked the blade for damage, and offered to sharpen it with a whetstone. Although he has never sharpened a sword himself, watching his workers taught him how to do it, and his keen observation lets him master every task with expert skill. He acted at once, but something went wrong when a loud scream came from the house and even scared the birds flying by. Senji called his name right away and asked about the loud noise and if he was okay, and Sinan said he was still working so they should stay quiet. It turned out something went wrong. When the man took direct action, the sword split in two. Sinan realized this was terrible. He had damaged the country's treasury, a grave crime that could mean execution by hanging, drowning, or beheading, and in panic he fell to the floor and hit his head. The man worried about what to do and felt very tense because no solution came to mind. Needing to calm down, he concentrated on clear thinking, immediately used the breathing technique he had developed, and a solution came to him. Sinan decided that if it was broken, he only needed to fasten it back together, so he began searching the boxes for anything that could help. In one of the boxes among many items, he found what he had been looking for, temporary glue. After a while, Sinan came out and thanked them for waiting. Senji said he had handled it quickly. It was immediately clear that he was the guildmaster. The boy reached out and asked to test it, but the man cut him off, called him an amateur, and told him not to touch the sword because nothing could be done with it for some time. Senji tried to argue with him, but Senna asked if he really meant to say he doubted him. The man tried to explain that this was not the reason, but he interrupted him again. Senji inspected the sword from afar and said he could still see rough spots on the blade. Sinan called it a lie, said there was no proof, and that it only needed to be folded back. The man walked to the box and decided to leave the sword there so he could blame them later if they noticed. As he put it in, it hit the side of the box. The sudden pressure on the sword made the broken piece fly off and hit the floor. Sinan was horrified, while Senji and the guards stood in shock. The man realized he was in trouble now. The guards were angry, Sinan's and subordinates were terrified, and Senji did not understand what had happened. The man began shaking, turned to the guildmaster, called his name, and asked why he was supposed to fix it. The guildmaster began mumbling something unintelligible. Fear gripped him as he glanced over his shoulder at his subordinates, who were clearly unhappy with their boss's actions. After that, he scratched his chin, looked thoughtfully at the ceiling, and said it was so strange he was absolutely sure he had fixed it and thought he might have confused it with another one. Senji flew at him, grabbed his collar, demanded to know what he had done, and called him stupid, clearly furious. The guy squatted down and said the man had broken him and that he knew he could not be relied on. Sidon immediately started shouting that it was rude. Senji even shed a tear, but when the guildmaster finished speaking, Senji pointed at him and declared him under arrest. While drinking tea with Militar, the main character learned that Militar had been fired from the guild. She was shocked and could not believe they would fire such a famous blacksmith. His boss was an idiot. Military was clearly furious. She grabbed a fork, cruelly stabbed the cake, and called it the height of incompetence. Meanwhile, Sinan sat in the carriage between two guards, his hands cuffed, thinking about how things had come to this. Concluding it was all the main character's fault, he decided to get revenge. Militar approached Dorette and said she had asked him for forgiveness and to be their personal blacksmith. The main character said there was nothing wrong with that and asked what he should do next. And the girl said everything was fine and suggested he look in front of her. Military personnel assigned to the building said it was their forge, and Dorat said it was immediately obvious it was military because it was very large. After that, they went inside together. The girl turned to everyone and asked for their forgiveness, which drew their attention. The group noticed them and then greeted their commander. The boys immediately stood up, came to attention, raised their hands to their foreheads, and said they were greeting her. The military told them to relax. They obeyed her and then asked her about the men beside her. The girl, smiling and blushing, said he is the one who made her sword, and his name is Mr. Darrett. All the boys stared at them in disbelief. They clearly doubted her words because the sword performer looked different to them. Scratching the back of his head, the main character stammered that he was glad to meet you and that his name was Darrett. The boys started saying they had just met the legendary blacksmith, calling him an old man and saying he did not look like the sword's maker, so they assumed the commander was deceiving everyone. The protagonist listened and still could not believe he had made such a sword, and he noticed again that they called him an old man. Militara then asked where Nana Hikari was now. The boys hesitated, then said he had done some work and left. The girl sighed heavily and asked whether he had done it again. The guys said they'd warned him, but he hadn't even listened. The protagonist turned to the commander and asked if she meant the local blacksmith, but she interrupted him and said yes. She said their current blacksmith is Nana Hikari. His family has given large donations, and he is the only son of Duke Felgrond. Given his unpleasant nature, he was no blacksmith. For now, they could only keep his constant complaints under control. Neither she nor her subordinates especially liked that. The protagonist thought people like that were everywhere, and exhaled as the girl tried to say he was on a completely different level when the door opened. Nana Hikari appeared with an almost sparkling aura, smiling as he said it was dirty here, as always. Militara called his name, and the protagonist turned, looked at him, and realized the man looked exactly like his former boss. The girl asked the blacksmith where he had been, and he said he'd gone on a date. Then the brunette asked about the long sword, and Nana Hikari took it and asked if he meant that sword. Then the man tossed the sword into Prunette's hands, told him to hold it, and Prunette flinched at the command. He missed it and stayed indirect, keeping to the sides and darting around. The other man wondered if the guy was serious. Now the big shot wasn't hiding his terrible character at all. Nana Hikari smiled and asked their opinion of the sword and whether he had done everything perfectly. The brunette stammered a thank you, and he sighed heavily afterward. The protagonist looked at the sword and thought it was a terrible job, as if nobody had touched it, glanced at Militaru to ask her about it too, and at that moment the man saw him and began to get up. Nana Hikari said he'd fixed it, then ran up to the brunette, grabbed him by the collar, and asked if he had a problem with it. Just then the protagonist rushed over and stopped the man's fist aimed at the brunette. The blacksmith had not expected that. Durant looked at Nana Hikari with stern authority and said that if he was a blacksmith, he should fix his work, and Nana Hikari called him an old man and asked what he needed. The soldiers immediately stepped forward, spoke to the man and told him to calm down. She said he forged her legendary sword and that he is a blacksmith from Written. Nana Hikari looked at the protagonist, shocked, and asked her again whether it was really true. The girl began telling the man he was already a first-class blacksmith and that they would now have a second master, but she did not finish. Nana Hikari withdrew his hand from Dorette and firmly told him to show what he could do. Dorette asked him again whether he really meant him. The boy stood in front of them with legs wide and arms crossed, smiling as he suggested a blacksmithing duel. None of the others said they would fight with the swords they had made. Whoever's sword broke, he lost. The main character said he understood. With a smile, the man said there would be 2 conditions and held his hand up to show them. Nana Hikari pointed to the materials and said the first condition was that they could use them only to make weapons. The second condition is that one of this forge's workers must use his sword. He pointed at the crowd. He pointed to the newcomer Convi, and the girl was shocked, her mouth opening in surprise. The protagonist froze in shock. He asked again whether he should be there and how long she had been. She was so small he hadn't even noticed her. Direct was stunned by the situation, but he pulled himself together, said everything was fine, and agreed. Militar was shocked by his words and immediately called out to him. No one paid attention to her words, and Nana Hikari smiled as he said everything was decided, while the protagonist did not even raise an eyebrow and stared straight at his rival, making the girl angry. The man said the duel would be in 5 days, and that if he lost, he would return to his village. And the main character said that if he won, he would take his work seriously. Nana Hikari exhaled and asked what he thought of himself. After all, the forge is his. After that, he left the room, slamming the door loudly. Militar immediately bowed to Dure and asked him to forgive her, saying she had only made the situation worse. Dure replied she was not to blame, and at that moment Confi ran up to them. Tears filled the girl's eyes as she said she could only look after the sword and asked what to do. The protagonist smiled and assured her everything was fine, saying he would make her a sword that would ensure she never lost. Militaria was shocked by his words. He said they would use improvised materials to make quality weapons, warned that not every blacksmith could do it, then asked them to trust him and winked. After a while, the protagonist began making weapons, first heating the furnace, then scanning the room and realizing only D-rank materials were available. Pulling on his gloves, the man said it was time to begin. At that moment, Militari entered the room and called to him. She said she hadn't seen him work for a long time and asked to watch, and he replied she could only do so from afar, which she gladly accepted. Militari eased into a chair by the table and sat completely silent as the protagonist melted metal in the furnace. He thought he already had the plan in his head. First, he began beating the hot material, then closed his eyes to see the whole picture. His eyes opened wide and the material in his tools glowed brightly, lighting up the whole room. Militar, seeing it, thought it sounded good. It had only been a few weeks since he had last held a hammer, but that still felt like a long time. A fierce heat runs through the blacksmith because he can't help loving his craft, and the main character had a wide, happy smile on his face. The protagonist considered sharpening a sword to make a better one for Confi, and thought about using the magic thunderstone to increase its sharpness. The man sat cross-legged on the ground, folded his hands over the material, and knew he could do it. The soldier sprang to her feet and called to him. Darrett asked what she wanted, and she wanted to know if he was finished yet. The main character said that after 30 years as a blacksmith, he works faster, but there are a few caveats. After a few moments, the sword finally formed. It was S rank, and Dure regarded it as a genuine treasure, even higher than he had expected. Militare, seeing this, lowered her head and said he had clearly gone too far. The man scratched the back of his head and laughed sheepishly. A new day had come. The sun shone outside, and a crowd had gathered near the forge. The girl spoke to everyone. Militar smiled and said the protagonist's sword was ready. Then the protagonist turned to Confi and told her to come to them. The crowds murmured that you could tell the master was right because he did it so quickly, and they grew curious about what kind of sword he used. Could a fit walk up to Dorette and Militar, stand at attention, put her hands to her head, call them by name, and say the sword is really ready? The main character said she was right, and he wanted to give it to her right away, holding the sword out. Holding it in his hand, the protagonist said it was his own sword, but he clearly found that hard to believe. The man said he named it Kamina. It is the sword of the Thunder Emperor Kamina. It is ranked S, and its element is holy. Dure handed it to the girl and said it was sharp. She needs to be careful, and the crowd was shocked. Kanafi held it in her hands, and it seemed to glow. A blush rose on her cheeks as she smiled and said the sword was very beautiful. Militar said the protagonist had given his all, so she should not let him down or let those feelings go to waste. Confit saluted immediately and said she had taken everything into account. The girl said she would personally train the other girl before the battle. The crowd murmured happily and said that under the commander's guidance she would surely grow stronger. The military woman smiled at Confi and told her to be on the training field tomorrow like a bayonet, and the girl was intimidated by the pressure and agreed immediately while Dorette silently wished him luck. At the Nanahikari estate, she was furious and demanded to know how the protagonist had the nerve to do such a thing. The man was furious. Holding his hand up to the servant, he told her to look. His hand turned red and he vowed he would never forgive him. After that, he called her by name, but she did not react. He thought that made her seem capable, but creepy. He said aloud that he needed to record the beatings and sue him. The girl said he would not do it, and Nanahikari asked why she thought so. The maid wrapped his hand, said it was fine, and tied a bow for him. Nanahikari was clearly unhappy and bared his teeth in anger, while the girl ignored him, turned her head to the side and asked if these were really materials for a sword. Smugly, he declared these were S-rank materials and pulled the best pieces from his storage: full metal, earth dragon scale, thunder god stone, platinum steel, and eternal flame stone. He said this would let him forge the finest sword the blacksmith had ever seen. The girl said she understood everything. Nanahikari clenched his fist and told Dorette to watch, promising he would take revenge on him. The day of training arrived. Militar said it was impossible to make and fit a ballmaster in 5 days, and they still did not know who her opponent would be. The girl listened attentively. The commander went on to say, the most important thing is to keep the sword from breaking, and she knows how to do that. Confi said firmly that she understood she only had to parry the enemy's attacks. Militara praised her and told her to get ready. Declaring that her body would remember everything, she suddenly rushed into the attack. It was clear she was determined. Confi was surprised they skipped the theory and went straight into practice, and the main character was also stunned by what was happening. At that moment, Militari suddenly attacked the girl, and she stayed cold-blooded, raising her sword to block the blow. While this happened, the girl told her not to move to the side but to block with the blade, and she said she understood everything. After that, the military said they would fight again. Confi agreed and thought about how to block attacks with her blade. When the commander struck, she succeeded and felt very happy. Too distracted, she realized the commander was not in front of her and immediately called out to her. The girl came up behind her, slapped her on the shoulder, and said she had lost. Her opponent told her not to lower her guard in a fight, and the girl apologized. They agreed to try again. Watching the battles, the main character thought the girl had treated her student harshly since day one. Later, after dark, Confit collapsed onto her back with her arms spread out, covered in bruises and dirt, and she thanked the commander with all her heart. The soldier looked at her and said they would train with Kamina tomorrow, and the girl simply agreed. The girl, smiling sweetly, turned to the main character and told him to ready his sword for the fight. The man, taken aback, stammered and agreed. Night had fallen and a huge moon hung in the sky. All the forge workers sat in the dining room eating. The brunette ate aggressively and looked hostile. Someone else ate fast and focused. A man next to her shoved food into his mouth from a cup, and another person chatted pleasantly with colleagues. The brunette said the commander's training was still as tough, and Confi, embarrassed, asked whether they had really seen everything, while the other brunette confirmed it, and they slipped into the shadows. They told him conflict was truly amazing. For her size, she was doing well. The girl felt embarrassed by their words and asked whether they truly thought so. Confi objected when they mentioned the size and made an unnecessary remark, which one of the brunettes laughed at, while the blonde beside her asked the girl if it was time for him to leave. Confi picked up her tray and said she would leave. The guys agreed, and the blonde handed a towel to the brunette. His colleagues called Confit's name, so she turned and a towel hit her forehead, making her blush. The boys said the smiles on their faces meant she should not catch a cold. Smiling kindly, they showed their support with gestures as the girl bowed to them. Outside the window, the night was completely dark and nothing could be seen, and the protagonist stood by a column watching Confi train with a sword, practicing her blows. The girl's progress was obvious. She delivered blow after blow with fierce intensity, showed no fatigue on her face, and the man admired her. Confi paused, exhaled, and wiped her face with a towel. The protagonist called out and told her she had done a good job. He turned toward the voice. She flushed and asked if it was really Mr. Darrett, and he smiled and asked if she was really training so late. Confi replied positively that she does this every day. She wants to catch up with the commander, even if only a little. The girl smiled broadly as she pictured Militaru in front of her, and said her dream was to become just like her. The main character said he understood everything. The girl had been pushed around a lot, so he was worried and went to visit her. Her broad smile told the man he was kind, so he scratched his head, said he was only concerned, then asked if she really opposed it, and she said no. Confi said the main character made her a beautiful sword, so she cannot allow it to break. The girl pictured the artwork before her and said it was simply a beautiful sword. The sound like light peals of thunder awakening something unknown to her, and she clearly loved the sword. The protagonist froze for a second when the girl called his name, and he said he had disturbed her and would go back, saying it with a smile, then turned, waved, and the girl wished him good night. Seeing Confi's inspired face, Dorette could hardly believe she liked the sword he made so much and wondered when his work had last made someone so happy. The main character was clearly pleased. Smiling, he turned and said that everything was decided. The man walked along the road, thinking about how he would have to work with Kamina while humming a cheerful song. 4 days after the rivalry was announced, Nanakari was angry and dissatisfied and called for Gilmas. The boy asked why his sword was rank A and had no element. It was a sturdy blade. The servant was intimidated by the pressure. Gilmas looked deeply worried and stammered that processing S-rank materials was very difficult. Nana Hikari angrily said he didn't want to know anything, then waved the man away, who mumbled something about the payment. The heir of the house held a sword out in front of the man, then asked if he was truly willing to pay with his life. Gil had to run away from home in fear. Nana Hikari turned to his servant Eigen and told her to fetch someone for him, and the girl said she understood. After some time, a man came to him, the mercenary Detroit, who stepped into a Hikari and asked what he should really call him while also addressing him as Lord. The guy sat at the table drinking coffee, told the man everything about Dorrit, admitted he had failed to make an S-rank sword, and Detroit said the rank was not important. Then the man said he could defeat anyone with any sword. Right before his eyes, he crushed a large piece of metal with his bare hands. Nana Hikari studied the folded metal carefully. Detroit stood calmly, pleased with what he had shown. The boy felt it was obvious he could not lose. The house's atmosphere grinned, thinking this was almost too easy for him, but it would be even better this way. After that, Nana Hikari called the maid by name and told her not to tell her father or mother about it, and the maid agreed, though it was clear she did not like it. On the day of the competition, Nana Hikari turned to the protagonist and greeted him. The protagonist said they had not seen each other for 5 days, and the man praised him for not running away. At that moment, all the employees of the forage, as well as Militar and Dread, looked ahead in shock. They realized Nana Hikari had named Detroit as Confi's rival, and it was announced again that this was a duel between blacksmiths. People immediately recognized the man standing beside him, and questioned whether this was really the Detroit destroyer, and whether he had truly decided to send him into battle. People immediately shouted for everyone to look at the conflict. The girl stood firm, holding it in her hand as real lightning shot from it. Militar was furious, shouting that the fight was unfair and even clenching her fists, and the protagonist silently agreed. Nana Hikari examined the sword the protagonist had made and said it was clearly a fake. The men began setting the rules. You can win in only 2 ways. An opponent's sword breaks first, or someone leaves the arena. She complained that the rules were unfair. Detroit looked at Confi and asked whether this little girl was his opponent. She did not answer or show any fear, and the judge then drew their attention. Raising his hand, he signaled to start the fight. The man immediately lifted his sword and moved to attack Confi. As a mercenary, he was skilled in combat. The man hit the ground hard, sending dust and dirt flying everywhere, and Confi had to step back a little because there was too much. The spectators were also shocked by what was happening, shouted that the force was very powerful, and were nearly blown away. Detroit didn't wait for things to settle. He attacked the girl at once and told her she would get what she deserved and that she couldn't run forever. The man struck again, the blow sending the clash outward, and she jumped high, landing a good distance from her enemy. It turned out she had walked into a trap. As they moved, they reached a corner. Detroit laughed, and the people said the conflict had nowhere left to run. Forge workers and onlookers watched in shock, and one person said they could not watch this. Turning to Confi, he asked her to give herself up, but she answered firmly, a little angrily, that she would not, and he said he had warned her. The destroyer then said the girl would certainly regret her decision now. He strained his arms to show his strength. Confi looked at him and felt a little nervous because the enemy was serious. She then thought about how the commander had trained him so much, and how Mr. Dure had created Kamina for her. At that moment, Detroit swung his huge sword and told Confi not to die. Confi replied with steady determination that she would not lose. After speaking, she unleashed the full power of her sword. Lightning bolts erupted across the field and the surrounding area. The protagonist, Militar, and Nana Hikari were stunned. Thanks to that power, Confi managed to cut off Detroit's sword, the blade flying to the side as his colleagues watched in shock and began to discuss whether the destroyer's sword had really fallen apart. The protagonist watched closely, his expression clouding as he worried he had overdone it with the sword. The judge surveyed the scene and said conflict had won the battle, leaving everyone around stunned. Militar turned to the main character, smiled, called him teacher, then said they had succeeded, and he agreed. After that, Confi ran up to them and was very happy. She addressed the girl as commander, and the girl said she was a good girl. Detroit, staggering, moved toward Nana Hikari and was in shock. Durrett approached him with a smile and said that, as he had promised, he should take his work more seriously from that day on, and the man told him to shut up and not to speak to him. Nana Hikari pointed at him and said he was quitting this damn army and would sue them if they left him to die here, and his maid glared at him. She tapped him lightly on the back to shut him up, and he didn't expect it from her. Derrit, Confi, and Militar were stunned, as the maid apologized on behalf of her young master, and said she would scold him and bring him to his senses. The protagonist, the commander, and Confi watched the maid, Nana Hikari, and Detrius leave the battlefield. Later, at the man's house, the atmosphere made it clear he would never forgive Derrit, whom he saw as a bad person. Then, he turned to the destroyer and asked what he had paid him for. Detroit said he was retiring, and the man was shocked by his words. He added that he had lost to a little girl and felt too weak. After that, she stepped into the corridor and walked away, saying he would live in peace. He then said goodbye to them. The house felt full of anger. He called the destroyer useless and bad. Turning to the maid, he said it was her turn and called her a damn traitor. Nani Hikari demanded that the girl apologize for daring to raise her hand against her master. She said indifferently that she would admit hitting him, and he, without turning his head, told her to do so. The maid had already stepped aside when she mentioned him using S-rank materials and the destroyer living in the mansion. The girl said she had told his parents everything, then said goodbye and walked away. Nana Hikari was shocked by her final words to him. Running into the corridor after her, he called her name, reminded her she had promised not to tell them anything, and said he would fire her. At that moment, someone called his name. His parents were there, very angry and sending out strong waves of aggression. The man clutched the paper in his hand. Nana Hikari immediately called them. The father asked whether he had used materials they had prepared for sale to another country without permission. and the mother asked whether he was trying to destroy the family's reputation. They began loudly asking if he even understood what he was doing. Non-Hikari tried to explain, but they did not listen. Father said he had had enough. The father told his son flatly that he was being expelled from the family. The son was shocked by the words. The head of the family then ordered his servants to take him into the Taman forest, and Nana Hikari reached out and told them to wait, but the parents turned their backs and walked away. Nana Hikari reached out to his parents as they left, trying to stop them, and kept calling, but they did not respond. After some time in Taman forest, the man pushed through dense thickets as strange sounds came from all around, making him tremble with fear. Nana Hikari asked the void what they wanted from him, repeatedly said they should all go away, already had the first scrapes on his face, and thought he was surrounded by monsters and abandoned in the forest. All this happens to him because of the main character. Driven by envy, he challenged him to a duel. Nathakiri froze, lowered his head, and thought about why he hadn't just been more honest in that situation. Near the army forge, Militar told Konfi the duel was solid, and she fought like a seasoned soldier. The girl saluted the commander and thanked him, then said she had won thanks to him and his sword, and he smiled and said he had only made the sword. The protagonist said the girl made the main contribution. She smiled sweetly at the words, and just then someone called her name. Konfi ran straight to her comrades, thanked Dorette and Militar again for their help, and when she reached the others, they cheered, congratulated her, and said she was a good girl. Militar looked at her and said this day marked the start of her brilliant career, and the main character agreed. The girl then told everyone that from today on, Dorette would be the army's new blacksmith. The crowd cheered and chanted that he was an old man. He wished they would stop calling him that. At the same time, in the kingdom of Grossa, the palace was large and had several towers. Senji walked down a dark corridor when someone started shouting to be let out, and several people were standing in front of us, cell. It was Sinan, furious, shouting that they were keeping him here like a monkey and that they definitely won't get away with it. The man also spoke angrily about their failure to respond to his complaints, called them bad people, and one guard asked him what he meant while another told him to sit quietly. Senji paused briefly when a sudden pain from the noise hit his head. Then, after a few moments, stepped closer to thank the guards for their efforts, and they immediately saluted him. The man then opened the cell bars and told Sinan to step out. Sinan was surprised, and Senji was unhappy about having to do it. A new day began. A huge line had formed at the army forge. New arrivals were shocked to find the line again, and some started arguing among themselves. Inside the forge, several men said Dure's repairs made it easier for one of them to wield his sword. Another asked to have his sword adjusted, and a third asked to have his shoulder pads adjusted. The main character, holding a hammer in his hand, turns to them and asks them to wait a moment. Everything happens in the order of the cue. Several people stood inside the forge, watching Dorette handle the weapon. They glanced aside and saw a sword inside a box with a glass door, and people began calling it very beautiful. One of the men said he would become the owner of Kamina, another argued he would stop him and beat him, and a third stepped in and said he would not lose either. Konfi put her hand to her chest and declared she would become the true owner of Kamina. The brunette asked if it was really written that an S-rank feat was required, and the girl said it was true, giving as an example defeating one of the 4 demon kings as a commander. At that moment the protagonist heard those words and, shocked, realized Astif Militare had truly defeated the demon king. Konfi agreed the commander was amazing and said she must become stronger too. Dere said Militare was a true hero. Smiling to himself, the main character was pleased that the sword he had made was being used for feats, and when he looked at the hammer, he thought everything was neat and clean. By then, the visitors to the forge were happily talking about what Dorette had done to Kamina. Dorette impressed them as well. They wanted to become that kind of cool old man. Ladder ruined everything they said. He abruptly stood up and said he was done for the day, leaving the other man stunned, then stepped outside and told them to come to him tomorrow. At that moment, a female officer approached him with a smile and told him he had done a great job, noting it had been a very busy day. The main character agreed that the work was harder than in writing. He was now happy, and the girl laughed and said she was glad to hear it. The military said that because of Dorette, the soldiers have changed too, And since they all want to use Kamina, they decided to take training seriously. Smiling, the protagonist said this was the highest praise a blacksmith could get, then thanked her. At that moment, the girl bowed her head and apologized, saying she was very sorry that Her Majesty had limited him. Her Majesty then asked if she really meant that equipment and repairs should be carried out sparingly, and the girl answered yes. The main character said there was nothing wrong with that, understanding that a weapon like Kamina could not be everywhere or with everyone. Militar smiled warmly at him, a blush coloring her cheeks. She said she had come to talk about something important, and he asked about it immediately. The girl said Her Majesty wanted to see him, so she asked to go to the palace. Shocked, the protagonist asked whether it was really necessary to do it now, and she replied yes. He then asked why it was necessary and was clearly very tense. Militar explained that this was all due to his contribution raising the soldiers' overall motivation, which was a great achievement. The main character started to wonder whether the queen truly wanted to see a common man and what he should do when the girl called to him. The man turned to the soldier, stammered, and asked what a queen was, and the girl hesitated for a moment before saying she would explain it in a few words. The commander recalled every meeting and said she had been very strict. At that time in the castle, Queen Renaid of Glossas sat on the throne and announced that Amatsurugi was broken. Senji knelt and claimed that Seinen had deceived him, but Senji did not see his own incompetence and agreed to take responsibility. Sinan sat thinking the queen was beautiful. The girl rose from her throne and walked over to them, telling Senji he had made a mistake. He bowed his head to her, shut his eyes, admitted it was true, and said he was ready to accept the punishment. The queen drew out her whip, said angrily that the man knew full well she would not tolerate incompetence, and struck him on the body, his face flushing as he groaned. She said she would hit him even harder, and he replied with pleasure in his voice while Sinon stared in shock and asked what was going on. After a while, the queen finished punishing Senji, who lay on the floor oddly happy. The girl approached Senyon and told him it was his turn. She cracked her whip and accused him of being a bad person, the guildmaster who broke the treasure of their country. The queen told him to think about his incompetence, and he began screaming about the pain he was in to get her attention, so she angrily said he would no longer serve as guildmaster. Eventually, the main character serving in the military reached the queen's castle. The girl turned to him and called to him. He agreed. They reached the huge painted doors. Militar asked the man if he was ready. He hesitated at her question. The main character said he would need at least a year to be ready, his heart feeling like it would jump out, and the girl said it was a good joke. The guards began opening the door for them. Militar assured him everything would be fine. Her Majesty is kind to competent people. At that moment they entered, approached, and knelt before the queen, who said she was grateful they had come and was glad to see them. Militura thanked her and said she had brought Dareth. The protagonist admitted it was him. The queen smiled warmly and told him he was the wonderful blacksmith who made Kamina and Shinma. Raising her hand, she pointed at the man and said she recognized him as the country's best blacksmith. The protagonist placed his hand over his heart, closed his eyes, bowed to her, and thanked her, saying it was an honor, and his face turned red. The queen said he would have to deal with Nana Hikari himself, said she had other things to do so could not interfere, and apologized to him. She said her gaze was clouded, and the protagonist lifted his head at once and told her her eyes were not clouded but beautiful like precious stones. The queen laughed and smiled, saying he was not only a good blacksmith but also a thief of women's hearts. Dareth felt embarrassed by her words. Her Highness said she called the protagonist today about a very important matter and reported that Amatsurugi was broken. The man immediately asked her again about this sword, and the queen asked him if he had really forgotten. A rack with clear glass was placed in front of him. Her Highness said the sword was an Amatsurugi, and the protagonist apologized to her. He thought it was the most beautiful sword he had ever seen, and the queen said a nobleman admired it every day until it changed, after which the nobleman decided to donate it to the state. The protagonist considered another evolution to S rank and how to repair the sword he could not remember. His eyes suddenly opened wide in shock as he remembered his military student's words that the queen was very strict. Dareth apologized politely, saying he could not remember anything at all. The queen, surprised, said she could not understand how he had forgotten what he had done with his own hands, because such things are not easily forgotten. Smiling, the girl said he was a very interesting man, and she was curious about his behavior, and though he was a little reserved, she remained interested in him. Duret was puzzled that an aristocrat would keep admiring a sword. To him, it was very strange for someone of high birth to simply admire a weapon. The queen said she wanted to request repairs to Matsurugi, a sword that had recently broken, and that this was very important to her, making the repairs one of her top priorities. The man was taken aback by the remark and had expected anything but a request to fix the sword. Examining the sword, he realized that on closer inspection, it was not quite right. The girl said there was something else. Another middle-aged man burst into the room, fell hard onto the cold floor, and was roughly pushed in as if he had committed a very serious crime. The couple stared at him, clearly surprised that he had turned up at all, especially in such a state. The man lay on the ground, unable to get up, as if he had been thrown so hard he was left unconscious. The queen said he was the same idiot who broke the sword, and she had a request for Derek, her tone making it clear the request could be serious. She asked the blacksmith to take her on as an apprentice. Her motives were unknown, but she spoke sincerely. The man on the ground found new strength and frowned, clearly disliking the queen's words and growing angrier with each one. Trying to defend himself, he said he could learn nothing from that trash, but the queen replied that he was the only trash here and the one to blame for everything. Still arguing, they ignored everyone because they were too wrapped up in their own fight. Duret realized the whole situation was now in complete darkness, and it was probably worth doing something about it. The girl agreed one of her subordinates would look after them, and added his name was Senji, a friendly man with the same charming looks. A brightly smiling boy walked into the room and said he wouldn't let Sinan cause any trouble, and his voice was confident as if he were 10 times stronger than he looked at first. With his arms folded across his chest, Duret knew he could not refuse the queen and had no choice, since refusing her could cost him his head or worse. Smiling sharply, he said he would do whatever the queen wanted, unable to refuse and with no choice but to accept at the moment. The girl said she looked forward to the man's success, speaking sincerely as she escorted her guest out of the throne room. The whole crowd left the royal chambers, and the heavy door slammed shut behind them, signaling they were no longer visible to the queen. Duret sighed and pulled his hands up sharply to stretch his back, realizing he had been worrying for nothing and could relax now. He stretched his neck and suggested returning to the hotel, and now a good rest after such an adventure is the only thing he can think about. The girl asked where he was staying. The man said he was staying at a hotel in the Eastern District. It was a good place to stop and rest. Senji suggested he stay at the National Guard dormitory, but Duret was embarrassed and said it was not worth it because he would be embarrassed there. He assured them that he was staying in a very good hotel, so there was no need to worry about him. The man offered to see them off because he could not leave his guests without proper attention. Duret pointed to this place where he stopped, a small 2-story house with many rooms inside. It looked cozy. He came in and told Dell he was back and glad to have some time to rest. The girl smiled and told the man she had started to worry because he had been gone so long, which made her woman's heart uneasy. Militario was displeased and loudly announced she would live here too, which greatly surprised the couple who had not expected such a sharp outburst from her. With a sinister smile, the girl said she would live here too, starting today, and her firm voice and upright posture made clear she would not let Derek go easily. Dell nodded awkwardly and said she would prepare the room soon, feeling uneasy about the girl's anger since it was rare for someone to look at her as if they wanted to burn her. Turning sharply, she changed direction because she urgently needed to know something. She asked whether to prepare a bath or dinner first, and the man replied that if Military were here, dinner would come first since he cared for his companion as if she were his daughter. The girls in Sinan did not like this and became very angry, each for their own reasons. The man shouted that it was unfair for only Derek to be spoiled, saying he was here too, openly jealous and wanting the same attention from the sweet girl. Sangji kicked him and said no one would let him stop here, angrily refusing to let him continue like this. Dell said regretfully there were no free rooms left, only stables. So Sinan, despite wanting to stay, would have to leave. Surprised by his impudence, Sinan offered him the stables while Senji, already getting angry, grabbed him by the ear and tried to drag him away. The man clearly disliked this. One reminded her he was the guild master, and the other said he was already a former master, so it no longer mattered. Dell asked the couple to wait for a moment, Military turned sharply to her teacher, wanting to ask something. Surprised, the man turned his attention to the girl and became curious about what she wanted from him. She asked if they had plans for tomorrow and received a negative answer when the man said he had absolutely nothing planned. Inspired, the girl said they could then spend the evening alone together. Derek shook hands with the man, who was very pleased to meet the blacksmith, and said he had heard a lot about him. The man rubbed the back of his head and said Nana Hikari had fired everyone, so they had no choice but to go outside. They were all just glad to be back with their commander, because they had not seen each other for a very long time. Suddenly, his voice took on a different tone as if he were about to reveal a secret. He said many people like Nani Ikari could break the national treasure he had asked for and should be punished, and he had only been spared because the queen was merciful. Senji suddenly appeared beside him and reminded him it was time to begin repairing the sword. Dure was grateful for the reminder because he had almost completely forgotten. They reached a bag that was clearly filled with something large and heavy. Senji suggested storing this in the bag with steel ore, larval stone, aqua stone, magic fortification stone, and some other small stones. He hid it from Nana Hikari because it would be better for Duret, a skilled and passionate blacksmith, to use them. He said that if the man could repair them with a matsurugi, it would be a great honor for them. Derek examined the stones more closely, said he could definitely use them, and felt glad to have such wonderful objects. The nearby company asked to watch the blacksmith at work, and the man gladly agreed because he was pleased they wanted to watch. The sword gleamed with beauty, its craftsmanship superb and almost flawless. Remembering how he had made this sword, he praised himself because the work was done very well. Suddenly, he seriously wondered if he could surpass his former self, and it was uncertain he could repair a sword as well as he had in his youth. The whole team gathered close to watch the man prepare for work. They were all excited and couldn't wait for him to begin. Pulling on his gloves, the man realized it was pointless to worry now, and he needed to focus on other things, like exactly how to fix the sword. He set to work patiently like a true blacksmith and endured for a long time. But by then it was too late to turn back. The sword was ready in no time. The nearby crowd was impressed that the man managed it so quickly. They were always surprised by how fast he worked. 3 young blacksmiths tried to learn exactly how he repaired the sword and what he did, and they asked to be his apprentices. Their eagerness to match Derek's skill embarrassed him. Military was nearby, smiled brightly, and said her teacher was very popular, feeling proud of him as if he were her own father. Embarrassed, he told her not to overstate his abilities, but then he noticed Sinan standing beside him looking angry and forced an awkward smile as if guilty about the attention. Dorit said he had to work on his hammer handling first because his skills were very low and needed more practice. Angry, he shouted that no one should give him orders, since being commanded felt like a grave insult he could not allow to dent his pride. Senji hit him on the head and told him not to act so arrogant. It was a cruel sight, and no one said anything. Derard handed the man a hammer and asked him to strike a sheet of metal, warning him not to hit his fingers since it could cause serious injury. He suddenly grabbed the hammer. The nearby crowd did not believe in him or his abilities and could not imagine he could manage it. Sinan raised his hammer, aimed at the metal, and prepared to strike, determined to humble all who had offended him and show he had great talent too. The attempt failed, and he still hit his finger, as expected from someone like him. The man started rolling on the floor and screamed from the intense pain in his finger. Derek asked if the man was okay, and Sinan warned not to approach him because he was very angry, especially with Derek, since he was jealous of the blacksmith and the attention the blacksmith was getting. Senji hit him again and ordered him not to swing the hammer, and the nearby crowd began to whisper, puzzled by Senin's behavior and clearly unhappy with what they saw. The man shouted that they should not look down on him, and Dure realized it would be very difficult for him, because such a wild student was another matter. That evening, everyone went to the bar to toast the appointment of the new Mr. Doret, a bright moment for all and a happy night. They raised their glasses and shouted they would drink to the last drop, and in that moment they were happy and wanted to forget their problems, at least for the evening. The mood among the military gays grew darker. She wanted to know something, and that evening she was clearly unhappy, her face not hiding this displeasure. She asked why Dell and Comfy were there, clearly expecting to be left alone with the man and spend the evening with him. Direct said he had invited them, and that a blacksmith and some soldiers were there, which angered the girl because she had pictured a romantic evening, not one spent drinking with men. Without thinking, she grabbed the mug and drank quickly. Kunfit tried to stop her commander, but it was already too late and nothing could stop her. She slammed the mug down, told him not to irritate her, and beer slightly spilled over the rim. But the military had no plans to stop, so once she started, she would drink until the very end. Thinking about alcohol, she remembered the Doretta dolls she had, the 25 and 40 versions, 2 small homemade dolls tucked snugly on her belt. Too late to stop her. Alcohol had clouded her mind and she began to play with dolls, which surprised the man next to her because he did not react even to a drunk person. The nearby team thought the girl's new doll was cute. Rather than criticize her hobby, they supported her as best they could and celebrated with her. Confi said she will keep playing like this until bedtime, and it's best not to touch her unless someone here wants to get in trouble. Derek could no longer picture the militarium commander. She no longer seemed a stern woman issuing orders to her subordinates. Dell turned to the man and said she had heard he had taken part in a duel between blacksmiths, which had greatly worried her, and she wanted reassurance. She pointed out that he had made a fine weapon for Kanfa, and thanked him. Dara said it was just his job, and tried to downplay the praise instead of admitting he was a great blacksmith. The girl told him not to be modest, saying the wonderful sword let her defeat a very strong man, but he denied it, claiming it was all Confi's training. The girl looked at them with wide-open eyes, like a child looking at her parents with big doll eyes. She approached him suddenly and asked if he would make a weapon for himself. She was very interested because the idea of Mr. Dorette having a weapon was remarkable and unusual. Dore felt embarrassed and said he was not an adventurer or in need of weapons, since he was a simple blacksmith with no plans to fight like many in the city. Militar asked why not. Now she was determined to convince him that a homemade weapon was a great idea and that he should at least consider it. The girl said that if he uses his own weapon, everyone will see its quality clearly, and then people will want to order weapons from him. The man considered it and realized it made sense, though he was not entirely sure, so he decided to think it over carefully before refusing. The girl's words made him view the doll that held a spoon, which he treated like a weapon, as his personal weapon, and he almost agreed to the adventure. In the street before the crowd, Militania announced that Mr. Jarrett would build a weapon for himself, which pleased everyone who had come to hear her. She said it would help him defend himself. The man said having a weapon would let him hone his blacksmithing skills. Nearby, the crowd cheered at the idea, happy that the man would make his own weapon, and sure it would be amazing because they never doubted the great blacksmith's skill. Smiling warmly, the man suddenly thanked everyone for their support. A shout in English came from nearby. The crowd fell silent at once. Sinan shouted that everyone had forgotten him and he clearly disliked it, calling it unfair and wanting all the attention that Dorette got. Shouting that he needed a weapon too, he demanded to know why only Dorette could make it, and insisted he was worthy to wield the great weapon she alone could forge. Someone suddenly grabbed his ear again and yanked him hard to stop his foolish talk. Senji sent him back to work with the hammer, which was far better than letting him speak. The people were neither embarrassed nor surprised. They knew it would happen because such a person needed to be stopped in time. Derek gave an awkward smile at the whole scene, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Where are the Gloss Army's houses? Derek searched through one of the boxes, trying hard to find the item he needed. Picking up 2 stones, he realized this material would be far more suitable. A quick look at the stones showed him what he would need and what he would not. Searching other boxes turned up more items that could help, and he welcomed every small thing in the warehouse for his work. Melita told him to use A-rank materials and reminded him he could do so without hesitation because no one would object. The man said no and added that a low rank would be enough for him, and he did not want to take high-rank materials. Dorette said he wanted to leave the best for the soldiers. He could not keep it all because people around him needed it more. That phrase made the girl see how good he was. She opened her eyes wide and realized the noble man before her had a kind heart and a generous soul. She shrank and began to tremble. Surprised, the man turned around, unable to understand why her behavior had changed so suddenly, and felt frightened for a moment. Wiping away her tears with a handkerchief, she said her teacher was a very noble man, and could not imagine how vast the soul of the person standing before her was. He replied directly that she was overestimating his abilities, and added that he had taken everything he needed and was ready to go, since he was already impatient to start working on his weapon. A crowd gathered around him, eager to see what kind of weapon he would make, and everyone was ready to help or offer ideas. Scratching his head, he admitted having many ideas, but not knowing what to make. A loud female voice from the crowd suggested making a sword. Proudly, the girl said she could help with sword training and hoped to make her teacher a student, so she could repay him for the help he once gave. Sighing heavily at the mention of the sword, he did not believe he could control it. He wasn't convinced this was a good idea. Visions filled his head of himself clumsily trying to wield a heavy sword and failing. Duret put on a glove and said he would rather do something else. Militano was surprised and didn't understand him at first, but he stayed silent and picked up a hammer. After showing it to everyone, he said he would use a hammer as a weapon and smiled as he imagined how he would make and use his own weapon. The nearby crowd was surprised, and they did not expect to hear about a weapon, let alone one that was a hammer. The man said that as a blacksmith he uses it often, so it will feel familiar and be the most convenient weapon for him. Threat said that because he was used to swinging a hammer, he would be better at using it as a weapon and would learn more easily. The crowd understood this was all a blacksmith could do, and they would back any plan he offered, so they welcomed his clever weapon idea. After working continuously for a while, he showed the people a huge hammer. It looked heavy, but also very reliable. The crowd was stunned by the size and quality of the man's work. They hadn't expected such a high level, but they clearly liked what they saw. Looking at his work, he thought it looked good and said only a name was needed before the weapon was fully ready for use. Militana stepped closer and said she had a great name in mind for the man's new weapon. The crowd was sure the girl would give the sword a great name, since the commander was the best at naming weapons. Proudly, she suggested the name Doretta's hammer. Sure it would please everyone standing next to her now. Everyone fell suddenly silent, including Dorette, clearly frozen in shock at that name. The crowd erupted in loud cheering. They liked the name, but the man disliked it and thought it was terrible. The crowd shouted that the name was really cool and a great fit for a weapon, and they clearly liked it. The man disliked it, but he couldn't say so because several pairs of eyes were on him, waiting for him to comment on the name. After a few minutes of silence, he said to let it remain, unable to shatter the crowd's bright dreams by refusing such a terrible name. The whole crowd screamed with joy, and Dorette was glad they were all happy, because that was the most important thing to him now. Direct Tamer. If you infuse a hammer strike with magic, it will hit with the force of a falling meteorite. A few weeks later at the second training area, in the middle of a field, a man practiced swinging a hammer to build strength and make the weapon easier to use later. A man nearby praised Dore for doing very well, and Dorette thanked him, wiping sweat from his forehead after a hard workout. The instructor told the man to release the sword in time during a strike and to be more careful, because in that stance, he is very vulnerable afterward. Darrett said he understood. The young man said a hammer, unlike a sword, could be used as a shield and added that the man needed to practice defense, and Direct replied that he had hopes for him. At the start of training, his body would not obey and he could barely move, so training was very hard. Almost without thinking, he swung his hammer again with a confident, powerful motion, as if attacking the enemy right in front of him. Everything was much better now. His body had begun to obey, and movements and swings were no longer so difficult. He was very happy that his training time had not been wasted. The guy shouted encouragement, saying the man was doing very well, and he was very happy for his new friend's success, and sincerely believed his skills would get even better. His experience as a blacksmith made the hammer easy to handle, and it proved easier to wield than he had expected. It was the weapon that suited him perfectly. He trained a bit longer, and then they both decided to take a break because the man trains almost all day. Darrett sank into the shade of a huge tree and sighed, resting briefly after his grueling hammer workout. A girl suddenly appeared beside him and said he had done a very good job, then walked proudly alongside him as if she had been watching his training for a long time. Militar said he had no free time because of all the training, and Dorette was glad to see the girl, since it is always nice to see a familiar face. She added that thanks to him, the soldiers enjoyed studying and spending time with him, and he was their authority and main role model. He glanced at the nearby trainees practicing, some swinging training swords, one running, a group doing push-ups, everyone busy with their own drills. A smile crossed his face as he took in the powerful scene, and his gaze fell on the girl's belt, drawn to something hidden under her cloak. Two small man-shaped toys hung there. She still carried them, which surprised him. One was from when she was 25 and the other from when she was 40. The sight moved him. When Military asked to sit next to him, he agreed right away, since he always enjoys pleasant company and finds spending time with someone better than being alone. Dorette wondered whether he had really thought about it. Those days were eventful, heavy with danger and filled with the adventures he faced. He knew that without her letter he could not say what would have become of his life, and that he might have ended up living in far worse conditions after being cruelly deprived of his job. He felt he had discovered a new world he wanted to explore. The man realized that if things went on like this, a cry that trouble had come pulled him from his thoughts, and the couple turned to the person who had broken their silence. The young soldier hurried to his commander and said trouble had come, and his frightened face showed the situation was serious and needed the captain's intervention. The girl sprang to her feet and asked what had happened, her voice turning stern as she shifted between resting and working because she had to act fast. The man began to say that in the forest of stone trees, we saw steel bears and other special creatures and learned they were A-rank monsters, among the most dangerous in the forest, so the situation was very serious. Hearing this, the couple were shocked and realized they needed to act quickly to prevent things from getting much worse. Entering the panicking city, the couple saw everyone running and grabbing belongings, trying to save themselves and their loved ones. Dorette asked what kind of monsters they were, and Militar remembered she had not told the blacksmith about the monsters, because he probably did not know about the key events. Simply put, they are much smarter and more aggressive than regular monsters, so they are far more dangerous to ordinary adventurers and should not be approached again. The man said it was his first time hearing about these monsters, and the girl explained they are very rare and little is known about them. She said these monsters attack suddenly as if they hate people. As soon as they see someone, they try to kill. They act only on instinct, which makes them very dangerous. Jarrett looked surprised and asked whether it was really that bad. The girl agreed, saying she knew not everyone could handle those bears and that meeting him could cost anyone their life. The man clenched his jaw. The information frightened him, and he realized how serious everything was. Militanic stepped closer and, ashamed and afraid of the answer, risked asking if the man could go with her. Bowing his head, the man fell silent for a moment, and when he came to, he asked why they needed him there, saying he could not call himself a good warrior for such a task. At the front of the crowd, the military loudly announced that everyone already knew. The arrival of steel bears in the Stone Trees forest was very serious, because they could easily harm people nearby. She added that the bears' power is their steel armor, so the girl tells everyone to target the unarmored weak spots to help defeat the monsters. To finish her speech, she said the materials from killing the bears could be used to make weapons. Militana said Dore would go with them. The soldiers were happy with the news and felt better. They believed the man could help them in difficult times, even though he was not a warrior, and they all trusted him. Smiling, the man said this was a great chance to test his skills and training, and you would be happy to work with them. Militana shouted that the bears' bodies were very tough, and normal attacks would barely hurt them, implying they had to use every advantage to defeat such dangerous monsters. She ordered everyone to remember this, and the soldiers all answered loudly and approvingly, knowing how serious it was and that they could not argue. Once aboard the transport, the entire team set out, a vast column of soldiers heading into the forest to destroy the monsters. A few hours later, he noticed it was already very dark around him, and that bothered him because fighting in the dark was much harder than in daylight. The team reached the forest of stone trees and stopped. They must make a careful plan so they do not immediately lose to the bears and cannot act thoughtlessly. Militana ordered them to split up and search for the bears, and the soldiers agreed loudly. Everyone ran in different directions at top speed to explore the whole forest and its hidden corners. Stepping forward, the girl said it was time to leave, gathered her strength, and prepared to lead her small group and protect them with her life. A small group walked through a dark forest that clearly did not welcome guests. The forest's atmosphere promised nothing good. Instead, it frightened them and suggested people had no business here. Confi was shaking and said quietly that a real battle was far scarier than she had expected, and training felt completely different, nothing like a real bear hunt. Direct admitted he was a little nervous, which surprised the girl. She had thought an adult like him feared nothing, but she was wrong. The man kept saying they had nothing to fear, since nothing was happening and there was no point in worrying for now. Militar was with them. Confi knew he was right. They were safe beside the girl because she was much stronger than both of them and could easily defeat the bears. The commander added they also had 2 holy weapons that would surely help them win the battle against the bears, Doretta's hammer and sword. Militara said it ignores all damage except holy, and only Dorette's weapons have the holy element, namely the hammer and the girl sword. She said the previous blacksmith was made from the same materials but could do nothing, which was not surprising because such a blacksmith was useless. This is a cue to her teacher. Everyone who wasn't too lazy wanted to become his student because it would bring them honor and a little glory. And the man understood everything. Scratching his chin, Dorette realized he needed a holy weapon to defeat the monsters, as the girl had just said. Militana agreed and said it was good the man was coming with them because that improved their chances of winning. And with 2 holy weapons and a strong team, they had a real shot at success. A strange howl reached all 3. The trio turned sharply. In the quiet forest, every sound seemed much louder, so the team reacted quickly to the howl. A huge crowd of goblins was behind them, and all 3 tensed in surprise, clearly not expecting to encounter goblins on the path. Confi began shouting that they would all be eaten, and Dorette's eyes widened at the sight before him because he had not expected guests in the forest, so he tensed up and realized he did not know what to do. Militant counted them and reported there were 5. She assumed their lair might be nearby. The goblins had already raised their weapons to attack. Dorette asked if they would fight, and the girl said no because she clearly planned to do something other than fight. Militana warned that if they sensed danger, they would run away, then picked up a stone and hurled it at the goblins with all her strength to scare them off quickly. One blow struck 3 goblins at once, knocking their small clubs from their hands and leaving lumps on their foreheads. Most of them ran off immediately, but 2 stood their ground and stared at the team, trying to intimidate them with their gaze. They were clearly not going to retreat so easily. Dorette thought carefully, and seeing the situation realized fighting was unnecessary, so he decided to focus on something else to avoid getting into another fight. The goblins raised their weapons and shouted as they prepared to attack, determination shining in their eyes to defeat the intruders. Confi panicked and screamed. Terrified even of simple creatures like goblins, she believed she was too weak to face them. Militana stepped forward and told them to stand behind her, but Dorette stepped up instead, which surprised the girl and made her tense because she had sworn to protect them herself, not the other way around. He tightened his huge hammer and attacked the goblins, hurling them several meters away from the team as if flicking dust from a shelf. The girls stood stunned and had not expected such a hard blow from the man, their mouths hanging open as they watched what unfolded. After falling to the ground, the goblins quickly stood up and ran away, clearly terrified as shown by how fast they fled. Smiling, the man grew proud of himself, and seeing his training pay off, he had not expected to land such a powerful blow himself and was pleasantly surprised. Smiling, the girls watched the picture of a strong man saving them and were delighted by what they had just seen. Confess shouted that Mr. Darrett was amazing, seeing him as her hero and savior from the terrible monsters that could easily eat her. Militana said gaining that much strength in a few weeks is remarkable. The training was very useful and has already produced results. The man smiled awkwardly and thanked them for the compliments. So many compliments embarrassed him. He wasn't used to so much praise, but he enjoyed it. He urged them to keep going because they could not stop now, since they were almost at their goal, had very little left, and needed to keep moving. A loud, inhuman cry rose from deep in the forest, a bad sign and possibly the bear they were looking for. Terrified, Confa called out loudly, asking what had made that inhuman cry, which frightened her deeply, and she tried to find its source to calm herself. Darrett tensed and turned to the military officer, showing he was waiting for her orders. He could not act without a direct command from his captain, so he must avoid doing anything unnecessary. The girl ordered them to stay alert, because they do not fully understand what this is about, so they should be on guard and protect each other. The forest was empty, the screen stopped, and the silence grew oppressive, getting worse because the hush after such a scream only increased the tension. The team scanned the forest for any sign of danger to learn exactly what was threatening them, because they needed to know what they'd be defending against. Militana noticed something and, with a loud panicked cry, ordered everyone to lie on the ground so they could act quickly. A huge tree hurtled toward them at high speed, able to kill anyone it hit, thrown by someone very strong. The tree left a huge scar in the ground, a long ditch like a riverbed, and it was scary because it could hit someone. Everyone was scared, but only Militana kept her composure. As commander, she had to stay calm no matter what because she was leading the team. She approached the boys and asked whether everything was all right, and Dirat answered hesitantly that it was, though the sight had frightened him as he slowly caught his breath. Kanfei began thanking the captain through tears for saving her. The girl turned and became cautious. It was not over yet, and she felt the danger, ready for an attack from any direction. Deep in the forest, something reappeared, moving slowly toward the people, ready to spring out and strike quickly and quietly before anyone could notice. Out of the dark forest came an iron bear, standing on two legs in shining armor, a threatening figure that made it clear it was a dangerous monster. Direct was shocked by the bear's size. It was far larger than he expected and terrifying, because such a huge bear could kill with a single swipe of its paw. Militana did not wait and ordered Confet to act, and the girl hesitated before blowing the whistle to call for help because they needed more people. Everyone in the forest heard the sound and knew someone needed help, so they ran toward it to try to save a life before it was too late. Militana stepped forward and said proudly that she would fight, because she could not let anyone on her team face such a dangerous battle against the bear. She turned to her shin with a sword and slowly drew it from its sheath, the blade wrapped in a soft light that shone into the dark forest. Ready for battle, the sword gleamed as the girl stood firm to protect those behind her, refusing to let them be hurt. Shining with a magical light, the sword in the girl's hand greatly surprised Darrett, who had never seen anything like it before, since a weapon glowing so brightly was rare. Standing in front of the bear, she pointed her sword, refusing to lose and determined to keep her comrades safe. In an instant she vanished from everyone's sight, and the man was stunned by how suddenly she seemed to have evaporated into thin air. Military used her skill, Divine Flash, struck several blows, stunned the nearby couple, and flew into the air above the bear. Standing on the ground, she inspected her work but found nothing, and the bear and his armor were untouched, leaving the girl distressed. Her powerful attack had failed, and she couldn't believe it. Usually it could defeat anyone, but this time it did not even leave a scratch. The bear stepped aside and grabbed a tree as its roots slowly pulled free from the ground. Militano was stunned. She had not expected the monster to use that kind of attack. Grasping a huge tree, the bear swung it toward the girl without thinking. Powerful, whistling stones flew straight at her, closing in and threatening to inflict serious wounds. Calm and unafraid, the girl was ready for any attack, had earned her role as commander of the guard, knew what to do, and kept her face steady. One swing of her sword sent the monster's attack and all the stones flying back as if there had been no attack, and the girl did not even tense up. Dorette was pleasantly surprised at how easily she shrugged off the powerful attack. Her opponent hadn't expected that from a cute-looking girl, and Dorette was far stronger than she first appeared. Confit began to shout praise for her captain. Confident, she knew the girl would handle the attack, and never doubted her strength. Militaru said it's not that simple because higher-ranked monsters are more intelligent, making them much harder to defeat. The bear rose to his paws and charged straight at the girl head-on. Militano was surprised he had changed tactics. She did not immediately understand that he could get his bearing so quickly. She had to believe she would succeed and trust her own strength, because as a commander she could not let her team down. The girl took a fighting stance, fully ready for anything. Militana swung her sword, but the bear clamped the blade in his teeth. No matter how hard she pulled, she could not free the sword from the monster's mouth. The bear held the blade tightly with his sharp teeth. As the girl reached for the sword, Confi shouted for her to be careful, very worried about her commander after seeing that. The bear raised a huge clawed paw to strike, and Darrett saw it. He tightened his grip on the hammer, knowing that if he did nothing, the girl would suffer. He moved forward to help as quickly as he could. The commander couldn't be left to cope alone. One swing of his hammer pushed the bear away from Militar, who flew back several meters and dropped the girl's sword. Militaru thanked her for saving him. The man said quickly that it was too early to relax, his muscles still tense and ready for anything that might come next. Confess said uncertainly that she would run to fetch the other soldiers. She hoped to help and be at least a little useful. The girl told her to stay still, while a bear behind them lifted its head, ready to launch another devastating attack. The monster moved forward to attack the girl, fixing all its attention on the team's weakest, most defenseless member. Quicker than the bear, Militana grabbed Kung Fu, held him in her arms, and jumped away as the bear attacked. The girl kept her eyes closed because she feared the unknown, too afraid to open them and convinced she would die. Direct looked around in pain as the girls collapsed to the ground. Kanfa opened her tear-streaked eyes, hardly believing she was still alive. The girl began loudly apologizing to her captain, and Militana stood up, saying she was not badly hurt, and was actually glad the girl was all right. Seeing Militana thrown back, the man realized he could not send her after the monster again and had to figure out a plan fast before it was too late. Realizing help would not arrive soon, the man made a decision. At that moment, he had to protect the two behind him. Realizing he had phrased it poorly, he corrected himself and said he simply had to do it. Bracing himself, he tightened his grip on the hammer, knowing he had to act before it was too late to protect his friends. The bear rose onto its hind legs and turned to face the man, who was determined to destroy the monster and was already preparing to attack. A black aura flared around the bear, which clearly did not bode well. Direct was surprised he had not expected to see this on a bear. He realized that, like with flawed material, he could see every place something was wrong and notice every imperfection. Fired up with determination, Derek could work the same way he did with materials, spotting exactly where things were broken. The berry attacked, and the man used his hammer like a huge, powerful shield to block the clawed paw. Although he could see the weak points, the attack forced him to shield himself with his hammer, which greatly hindered him. The monster lifted its clawed paw to strike the blacksmith, poised with one powerful blow to kill and tear him apart. Militana began to worry about her teacher, but she gripped the hammer tighter as it filled with magical light, and he moved toward it. Pouring all his magic into the weapon, he produced a blinding light that overwhelmed his eyes and illuminated everything around him. The weapon left a huge hole where the remains of a huge bear lay, a bear the man had defeated so easily. Dorette looked around with wide eyes, unable to understand what had just happened or to believe he had done all this himself. A scream from Militaris came from above. She asked whether her teacher was okay, and he said he was fine, though he was in shock. The man could not understand what he had just done. When he went down the hole, the girl asked whether he really did not remember. She would find it extremely hard to forget a feat like that. She said that during the attack a very bright light filled the place, and when Derek asked if a hole had actually appeared, the girl replied yes. He couldn't believe he had done it. It felt amazing and left him stunned by his own abilities. Confi suddenly rushed into his arms, crying loudly, and Dorette, relieved he was all right, smiled awkwardly and apologized for making him worry. Militana draped her cloak back over her shoulders despite her injury and kept a professional expression for her team. Smiling, she said she'd handle the guards and joined a small group to sort things out and negotiate. The men around the hole said the hammer blow looked strangely stylish. Not a trace of the bear remained. To them it looked like a falling meteorite. Confi hugged Dorette, and he stroked her hair to calm her, understanding how worried she was, and not stopping her from crying out all her emotions. What matters most to him is that both girls are safe now, and he was able to protect them, and this warms his heart. A few days later, the soldier asks his mentor if he is okay, since he was hurt then too. Derue said his bones still hurt, but he would survive, and the girl said she had almost fully recovered and was proud. The man thinks it is great to be young, yet he sometimes regretted doing such things at his age. He asked if the stone forest was currently under guard supervision, and the girl was surprised by the question because she found it strange. Dorette was scared and thought he would have to pay for all the damage there. He then realized he could not afford those expenses and was very frightened. Militana was surprised again, but she laughed and said it was nothing and he should not worry, amused by the man's reaction to the defeat. She said this would serve as a reminder to future generations of the blacksmith's power, which surprised Dare and left him amazed because he had never expected to become an example for the future. Militana said everyone now called the man Derek the Punisher, which was good because that title could bring several advantages. The room fell into a tense silence. No one knew how to respond to those words. The man changed the subject after he noticed noise outside and assumed everyone was in a fighting mood, which pleased him. All the soldiers trained hard, motivated to reach Derek's level of strength. Militana noticed his feat left a strong impression on all the young soldiers. The man was surprised and had not expected to become such an example to everyone. Acting as Khan for Ran, she noticed a couple nearby she hadn't expected to see and was genuinely glad to see them. The girl put her hand to her head, stood at attention, thanked him for his hard work, and told the captain their goal was to run 10,000 laps. Dure felt baffled and alarmed by the number of laps. The idea that they would actually run exactly 10,000 laps seemed impossible. Militana said such training is exhausting but useful occasionally, letting the knights train calmly until they are completely exhausted. The girl suddenly ran closer, turned to her commander, and wanted to tell him something that was probably very important. The couple looked surprised and asked whether something had happened or whether she had already run all the laps. Confi replied no, that was not the case. Light footsteps were heard nearby. The girl said a guest from the Gross Magic Academy had arrived. Militana was surprised the guest arrived so soon, as she had expected him a little later. A pretty girl smiled as she approached them and said she and Derrit had not seen each other in 15 years. Surprised, the man found he had no idea who stood before him, and no matter how hard he looked, he could not remember. After Nana Hikari was banished, two voices were talking. One asked the agent how the plan was going, and the agent said the plan had failed. A girl said that a skilled blacksmith named Derrit was now the only blacksmith in Groza's army. The gentleman said good luck was unacceptable. Bowing her head, the agent apologized for speaking honestly, saying lying to her gentleman would cost her more. The lord knew she was a crucial pawn, and losing her now would not be his best move. He says he'll give his agent one last chance, which is a rare act of kindness from him. The girl closed her eyes and thanked her master for the kindness, relieved to be alive and spared from suffering, and grateful for a second chance to correct her mistakes. A rough voice ordered her not to waste it, and the girl had no reply, so she only agreed silently because her life depended on it. Dorrit asked the girl who she was, which made her very angry. Upset at not being remembered, she might have been offended, but she was no longer a child. She smiled, not a kind smile, and introduced herself as Issa, as if her name explained the whole story for her. Dorrit sensed an evil aura and a realization came to him, as if he were slowly recalling old events he had completely forgotten. He said they had played together long ago, and Issa happily agreed, took his hands, and said she was very glad to meet him again. In a gentle voice, she said she had been thinking about Mr. Doretta the whole time, and could not stop thinking about him. Militaru stepped between them, and told the girl to leave the man alone. Because he was very tired, she tried to pull the intrusive girl away from her teacher. Noticing the toys on her belt, Issa said the girl treated it like a toy and laughed a lot because she thought it was a very stupid activity. Covering her smile with her hand, she laughed at Militar's childish behavior, which enraged the girl. The girl was ready to kill her rival immediately, ignoring everyone around her. In a stern voice, she said she had been thinking the moment to settle the score was near, and now it had arrived, clenching her fists and almost ready for battle. They would never be friends. Sparks of conflict flew between them, and an aura of hostility surrounded them. Derrit smiled awkwardly, told everyone to calm down, and asked Issa what had brought her here, since she had arrived so unexpectedly and he was curious. The girl brightened and ran to the man, saying she really needed his advice, but someone's shout cut her off. A man ran up to them, and Izu explained that he was his deputy. The man said he was very pleased to meet him, and the deputy replied that he did not believe this old man was the best blacksmith. Not liking it, he spoke up. She did not dare contradict him. He warned that when he returned he would speak to her privately, and with that one remark he almost ruined his whole image. Militar was nearby and ordered the deputy to retract his words, personally vouching for Dorrit's skill and refusing to let anyone insult the man's strength because he was truly a great blacksmith. The man's expression changed dramatically. He said he was very glad to see the commander and praised her, saying she looked great as always. The compliment seemed very foolish to the commander. Dorrit found the old man terrifying and wondered if he realized how he looked. Then his thoughts were interrupted by someone screaming loudly. Sinon rushed over and told them he had followed the instructions. Yet the tool still broke, and he was furious, ready to scold and blame everyone for his failure. Dorrit turned at the shout and recognized the man who had caused the commotion. He was very surprised, because the man had appeared suddenly and made a claim. Senji bowed slightly and apologized for his behavior and for breaking the tools, feeling deep shame because the man had asked they be left intact. Suddenly, the deputy smiled oddly, switched on a sign, turned around, and rudely demanded to know what they wanted from him. With his arms outstretched in a friendly hug, the man said he couldn't believe a person like that was sitting in this wilderness, implying that someone so great did not belong in such a simple place. People nearby were surprised. They had not expected to hear that about Sinon. To them, he was just a spoiled fool who demanded too much and did nothing. The deputy offered the man a job as his special instructor and sounded too confident, as if he had known the blonde and his talents for years. He thought this would suit him because his appearance made it clear he was made for this kind of work, and he would enjoy it. Raising his hands, he shouted that he knew he was a real genius, trying to prove to everyone that he was one of the greats, as if he'd always been that way. The man said proudly that they had to go back to school to sort out the necessary documents. ESA tried to stop him because it was all a very bad joke. Angrily, the deputy said he would wait in his room for the girl when he returned and had no intention of speaking to her again. Sinon bragged to Dure about the difference in their abilities and told him to humble himself, so Dure began to see himself as great, as if others had spotted a talent in him no one else had. Both of them suddenly disappeared, and the whole company just gaped in shock, not fully understanding what had happened in front of them but choosing not to talk about it. Gross army military installation. Militar placed a cup of tea on the table and offered it to the guest. Durette smiled awkwardly and said that such a deputy was very difficult to work with, judging by his behavior and terrible manners. Issa sighed and admitted he was completely right. She apologized politely for the commotion, saying she was ashamed of what the deputy had caused. Remembering that the girl had been appointed supreme master, the man told her she should be proud, and she lowered her head in embarrassment. She credited the staff Dorette himself assembled for all of this. Surprised, he wondered what sort of staff he had made, because he could not remember making anything like it. Without thinking, ESA showed it because she knew Darrett had made it. She held the staff of the great magician Diwando, a 5th-rank weapon with the light attribute. The man stared at the staff in his hands and could not remember doing anything like that. No matter how closely he inspected its small details, no memory connected to the staff came to him. Isaac pointed out the staff had been made long ago and changed many times, so its appearance might differ from the original. Dorette was surprised that he wondered how he could call it his creation after so many changes, and felt ashamed to claim it entirely as his weapon. Putting those thoughts aside, the man asked what the girl wanted to discuss, and Isa replied that the academy was now running courses on the study of the holy attribute. She asked him to make staffs with a sacred attribute, and he said he could definitely handle the task, so the girl thanked him happily. Militaria said she was very interested in studying the holy attribute, had been drawn to it for a long time, and wanted to study it with other students. Having no urgent matters to attend to, she asked to take a look, and Issa agreed, suggesting they go to the academy right now. Dorette asked them to wait because he needed to get his hammer, which could not be left unattended. Isaac used her instant teleportation to get to where they needed to be as quickly as possible. When they arrived, the girl welcomed them to the Grossmatch Academy. The couple stood in awe at the sight that opened before them. The lovely gardens and the vast, elegant academy building were utterly mesmerizing. I was advised to begin by greeting the director, one of the academy's most important representatives. This was the necessary step before visiting the students. Seated at the table, the young woman greeted the team, said she was glad to meet them, and introduced herself as Elena Grossa, director of the educational institution. Militar said she hadn't seen Elena in a long time, and Elena replied she was glad to see Militar in good health. They were clearly acquainted and greeted each other warmly. Darrett introduced himself and said he was glad to meet him, but then something occurred to him and several questions came to mind. The principal said she heard how Direct created a magical staff with a holy attribute, and she hopes the man can help her students study that attribute. Issa said the girl was the queen's sister, and the man, surprised, noticed they looked very alike. Both fair-haired, tall beauties who would attract men's attention. Elena smiled and said she is friendly to those who work well and strict with the lazy, and that she expects results from Mr. Darrett. The girl wanted to introduce him to her students, but a loud cry calling Izu interrupted them and briefly frightened everyone since it was so unexpected. A deputy nearby was upset that the girl had not come into his room when she returned and asked why she had left with that misunderstanding. Feeling the crown on his head, Sinan bluntly demanded why such an ordinary gray thing was here and openly insulted everyone he passed. Durrett sighed. His headache was terrible, and he definitely did not want to deal with someone who could not do anything on his own, so he just wanted to rest. Someone abruptly grabbed Izu's hand and pulled it toward them, shocking Dorette and Militaru, who had not expected such a brazen, bro-like gesture and worried about the girl. The girl tried to pull her hand out of the deputy's grip. She screamed at him to let her go. The deputy smiled sarcastically and told her she did not dare contradict him. Dorette clenched his teeth in anger. The blacksmith pulled the man's hand away and shouted that his status did not permit such behavior. His size made it clear he was not weak and that he could break a bone if necessary. The deputy responded indignantly, saying he was one of the academy's most senior sages and asked how he was not ashamed to grab his hand like that. Dorette explained that the man would most likely not do anything Izu disliked, which frightened the deputy, who said he understood that everyone here was clearly stronger than him. Sinon urged the man to run before it was too late, while the deputy fled to save his life. The man started to run off, shouting for Dorette to take his advice and not do anything reckless, but Dorette still ran after the deputy. All three sat in silence, unsure what to say after that stressful situation, and none wanted to talk about it, but they could not ignore what had happened. The military asked about the girl's condition, and Dorette shouted that all this had to be told to the director immediately because she would probably be able to come up with something to help. The couple resolved to tell the director everything to support Iza. The girl thanked them, but declined to help. Smiling, she said she was perfectly fine. Her expression darkened as she said she had already grown used to it, and her face showed this had been going on for a long time. The Ret and the military looked at her with sadness and truly felt sorry for Iza now. The girl clapped her hands to change the subject. Eager to introduce the couple, she is confident they will please her students. Pointing to the day, ESA said they were now part of this audience and invited them to enter.